I was halfway through a paper cup of church lemonade when my 7-year-old grandson squeezed my fingers so hard I dropped the cup. The lemonade hit the fellowship hall floor and spread toward the folding chairs in a slow, shiny sunburst. "Grandma, please," he whispered, eyes not leaving the sketchbook on his lap. "Don't go to the basement." The rehearsal dinner murmur dimmed around us. Potluck macaroni, hymn books stacked across in warm candlelight. My son, Michael, stood across the room laughing with the pastor and the woman he was about to marry tomorrow, a woman with a smile like it had been measured and cut. My grandson's hand shook. On the page, he'd drawn our old farmhouse, the porch light like a star, the maple tree on the left, the stone path you could feel with your shoes, and there, underneath the house, a rectangle shaded so dark the paper had thinned, a little red door. Next to it, in awkward block letters, he had written 2 words that didn't belong at a church dinner: "Don't open." "Why?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the truth. He pressed the pencil so hard it snapped. "Because she told me the alarm is too loud," he said, barely breathing. "She said Grandma won't like loud things." The laughter behind us rose like a wave. Forks clinked. The pastor lifted a prayer card. I stared at the red door on the paper and heard something far older than alarms, something that came up from the bones of a house, the sound of a lie about to crack. If you're here, if you're listening, don't skim this part. Don't tell yourself children exaggerate. My name is Nora, and this story is about how a child's drawing saved my family, about the night I followed a pencil line into a secret I should have seen from the start. Like and subscribe if you need stories that end with the truth standing up in the middle of a small town and saying, "Enough." Leave me a comment about where you're listening from, because lies love darkness. And the best thing you can do for a lie is turn on every light. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the guest room at my son's place with the window cracked just enough to bring in a Vermont October breath, cold and apple sweet. The floor creaked when the furnace kicked on, running like an old dog toward winter. I watched the moon move itself from one side of the maple to the other and wondered why a boy would draw a red door on a basement that never had one. Ethan had left a sketchbook with me, uncharacteristic for a child who slept with it on his chest. He'd fallen asleep in the car coming home, cheek pressed to the booster seat strap, lips parted in a dream that made his fingers twitch like he was still drawing. When I carried him in, he mumbled something about the alarm again and curled toward my shoulder like he had when he was 2. I tucked him under the quilt in the room with the planets mobile, the one his mother had hung when this house was new. Then I stood in the doorway long after he slept, pretending I could hold the night at the threshold by will alone. Down the hall, I heard Claire's laugh from Michael's room. I wish I could tell you I kept an open heart about her. I tried, I did. She came into our lives at a time when everything felt tilted and slow. My daughter-in-law, Grace, had died in what the police called an unfortunate accident, a gas leak that turned a laundry room into a match head. Michael moved through that first year like a man underwater, doing the dogged, unspectacular things grief requires, packing lunches, asking pediatricians the same question twice, showing up to work in the same sweater again. He needed help. He needed kindness. And then there was Claire, introduced at a neighborhood barbecue as an interior designer who made spaces breathe. She brought peonies from a farmer's market with the dirt still on the stems and a Boston cream pie that sank in the middle in a way that made you forgive it. She kept her nails short and clean, wore simple gold hoops, listened with her whole face. She said she loved children, but had never met the right man at the right time. I wanted to be fair. Why shouldn't love arrive wearing good perfume and a steady gaze? Still, something in me lived with his fist closed. You don't raise a son from a rented apartment with one bathroom and then a little house you paint yourself without growing a quick second brain for danger. Mine had been humming since June. The first time I heard the hum outright was at Ethan's school. Mrs. Howard, a tidy woman who organized her life with laminated index cards, asked me to step into the hallway after pickup. The classroom behind her was a cheerful chaos of glue sticks, paper leaves taped to windows, a stuffed raccoon wearing a tiny scarf. "Miss Ethan has been quiet," she said, the way good teachers deliver news. "No edges at all." In a new way, he's always been thoughtful, but last week we had a fire drill and he froze. Not like the other kids. He covered his ears and wouldn't move. We had to carry him out. She looked at me like we were holding something fragile between us. "He told me the alarm at home is too loud now, and somebody unplugs it so it won't be mad." I felt my mouth go dry. "Who?" I asked, even though the names available were few. Mrs. Howard pressed her lips, not wanting to accuse. "He didn't say." Back at the house that day, I checked the alarms the way you check on old friends you've let go too long. 2 upstairs, 1 in the hall, 1 at the top of the basement stairs. Batteries fine, test chirp bright and shrill. I told myself kids make up whole universes out of a single noise. I told myself we were all stumbling forward through a grief that sneaks into the corners of ordinary things. I told myself what I had to keep dinner on plates. But here was my grandson's drawing of a red door in a place no red door had ever been. Here was the word "don't," written like the opposite of prayer. At dawn, I gave up the work of pretending to rest. I slid my feet into slippers, wrapped myself in the old navy robe with the broken sash loop, and made coffee as quietly as coffee allows. The first drip sounded like it echoed, which is how you know you need sleep. I set the sketchbook on the table and opened back to earlier pages. Ethan's drawings had a way of teaching you what mattered to him without showing you everything. A lot of houses with smiling windows like eyes, dogs with legs too long, cars with smoke that looked like cotton candy. He drew his father tall, which fathers like to be, and he drew me with gray crayon hair and a crooked smile. But in the last 2 weeks, the corners of his pages had darkened. He'd begun to draw boxes with things inside them. One was labeled closet with lines that looked like ropes. One was labeled laundry with a storm of scribbles where the machine should be. And then the basement, page after page, each darker than the last, that little red door, bright as blood in winter. I was pouring milk when Claire came in through the back door without knocking. She never knocked, which I tell myself neighbors in small towns get to do, but our back door and our neighbor's back door were separated by 2 yards and a chain-link fence with a lilac that had grown up and through, like a slow, fragrant rebellion. "You're up early," she said, like we were friends who had shared the same thought about sunrise. Her coat was open, though the air would chap your lips in 10 minutes. She kissed the air near my cheek, practiced almost. "Big day." I nodded at the sketchbook and closed it with one hand. "Big day," I said. "Are you excited?" She lifted her shoulders and dropped them like a dancer's warm-up. "I'm happy," she said. "Michael is a good man. Ethan is..." She paused, auditioning adjectives. "Sensitive. I think I can make a home for us. A new one. We all need fresh paint sometimes." She reached past me for a mug, and I saw the thin white line on her wrist. A scar. Older than this year. You don't live 65 years without learning to notice hands. She poured milk and added sugar with happy recklessness, then tilted her head at the sketchbook. "Ethan's?" I put my palm on it like a lid. "Yes." She smiled. "He showed me the house with the red door last night. So creative. He said it's a secret door." She stirred and stirred until the spoon made a sound like a small bell. "Kids and secrets," she said lightly. "We shouldn't encourage them." I moved the sketchbook to the chair next to me. "We shouldn't need them," I said. She watched me over the rim of her mug, and then, as if adjusting a picture frame by a fraction, she changed her expression. "Nora," she said, and I could hear the way my name sat too formally in her mouth. "I know Grace was special. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I want to earn your trust." "You can't ask for what you've already taken." I touched her arm for the first time since I'd met her. It was warm and smooth, and I thought involuntarily of lotion commercials where water beads up and rolls off. "Then let the house keep its alarms," I said, and watched her pupils flick the smallest bit to the left. By 9 o'clock, we were at the church to help set up the small reception area. Ethan stayed glued to my hip. He had that post-sickness aura children get after certain days, washed out and serious, like they have come back from some place without a map. He refused the donuts in the kitchen and asked for an apple, which the pastor's wife cut with a small paring knife that had seen more pies than I have birthdays. I thanked her and put the apple slices in a napkin, then followed Ethan to the fellowship hall where the tables waited like patient animals. The hall smelled like lemon oil and hymnals. At the far end, Michael and Claire were talking with Pastor Dan about readings. Claire touched Michael's sleeve and he smiled, and I realized that there is a kind of kindness that makes sons 12 again, no matter how many gray hairs sprout in their beards. "Grandma," Ethan whispered, tucking my sleeve, "don't go downstairs today." His eyes were on the hallway with the painted mural of Noah's Ark and giraffes who remembered to stand their heads next to windows. The stairs to the basement were behind that mural. The church kept overflow chairs down there, a grief support bulletin board, tubs of fake greenery, handbells for Christmas Advent services, and a big old furnace that clanked like a cowbell on cold nights. "Okay," I said, "because sometimes you don't correct the story. You change your steps." "I won't." He chewed an apple slice and looked relieved, then pulled his sketchbook from his backpack like a rabbit pulling a magician out of a hat. He drew on his knees, the way only kids and born painters can, whole body participating. I sank into a folding chair and watched Michael practice the reading he had chosen from Corinthians for tomorrow. Love is patient, it says, and sometimes love is a hallway you walk once more, even when something in you wants to turn around. When he finished, he glanced at me the way he used to from the pitcher's mound in middle school, looking for a nod. I nodded. That afternoon, I volunteered to take Ethan home while Michael and Claire stayed to do a final meeting with the caterer they'd hired for after the ceremony. Claire squeezed my hand too long when she thanked me and said she'd ordered extra cupcakes with little sugar leaves for our little man. I smiled with my lips. In the car, Ethan fell asleep in that limp, honest way kids do, cheeks warm, mouth open, breath whistling soft. At a red light, I looked at his hand on the armrest, the little crescents of dirt half hidden under his nails, because 7-year-old boys are a conversation between soap and earth. I put my hand over his, and his fingers curled around mine automatically. At home, I carried him to bed. On the dresser were 3 framed photos. Michael holding newborn Ethan like a sunrise he hadn't expected. Grace in a winter coat, laughing with her whole face, scarf crooked, and me in a garden hat, pretending I could coax tomatoes by sheer decency. On the nightstand sat the inhaler, empty. I didn't know whether to sit or run. The plastic cap was tight, but the canister rattled light as a penny. A date sharpied on the side showed it had been replaced 2 weeks ago. There was a second inhaler in the bathroom by the toothpaste, full. I didn't say anything when Michael and Claire came home at dusk. I made chicken and green beans, which used to be called supper in my mother's house. We ate at the small kitchen table because the dining room had been pressed into service for tomorrow. Suits and a garment bag with Claire's dress, a wreath made of eucalyptus that smelled like the breath of a clean friend. Michael talked about the caterer's temperamental van. Claire talked about place cards. Ethan ate 2 pieces of chicken and half a roll and dropped peas on the floor in a line like breadcrumbs out of a fairy tale. After we cleared, Claire offered to do dishes and I declined. "Tomorrow you'll have enough to think about," I said, taking the towel. She set the sponge down like she'd been waiting for permission. "I'll put the cupcakes in the garage fridge," she said, lifting the white pastry boxes. I dried forks one by one and listened to the garage door open and shut. When she came back in, she wiped her hands on her jeans like someone who cooked, not someone who carried sugar.
Night lasted a week. At 7 the next morning, the sky was milk silver. My neighbor's chimney wrote its small novel in the air. I made pancakes for Ethan, and he ate them with concentration. We put on good clothes. Michael looked devastatingly like his father in a blue suit. Claire floated down the stairs in a robe with lace at the sleeves, and then stepped into her dress with my help, while I told myself women have been helping other women into dresses since threads were invented. At the church, bells rang, and people arrived with faces scrubbed of everything but joy. The choir hummed. Pastor Dan hung his stole. The florist made an altar out of late October, rose hips and mums and eucalyptus and pride. I stood with Ethan in the pew behind the family row and let him thumb through a hymnal. He stopped on a page with a song about following the light even when you're tired. Halfway through the procession, Claire's friend tapped my shoulder and asked if I could help her carry down a box of programs that had been left by the copy machine in the church office. "Pastor says they're on the shelf in the basement," she said, already apologizing. "We'll miss the prelude otherwise." I looked at Ethan. He looked at the mural giraffes. "Grandma," he whispered. "Please?" I squeezed his shoulder. "Stay with Mrs. Larkin," I said to him, nodding at the woman who had taught Michael Sunday school 28 years ago and still clipped recipes for me. Then I looked at Claire's friend, a woman whose bangs had lost a fight with a curling iron. "Come on," I said. "We'll be quick." The basement smelt like old hymnals and winter coats. My breath looked like a rumor. I flicked on the lights by the top of the stairs, and a row of fluorescents served as their particular brand of kindness. We passed the bulletin board where the grief group pinned homemade flyers about Tuesdays and the coffee they brought themselves. We passed a metal cabinet with craft supplies. We passed the handbells case, and I resisted the childish urge to lift the lid and ding one. Claire's friend walked ahead in her pretty shoes, and I carried the feeling that choices were a hallway, and I had been walking this one all my life. We found the programs, a box of them, with the clip art bevs my generation never learned to love. And when we turned back toward the stairs, I noticed the furnace closet door. I noticed the scuff mark high on the wall, a streak like the arc of a flung something. I noticed the smoke alarm on the ceiling above me and the absence of its soft, patient red blink. Where there should have been that tiny heartbeat of light, there was nothing. I stood very still and then turned in a slow circle. The alarm sat dead. No chirp when I hit the test. No blink, awake. I looked at the baseboard and saw the line of an extension cord running along it, disappearing under the door to the furnace closet. "You okay?" Claire's friend asked, hugging the box. "Fine," I said, and my voice was not. "Should we hurry? They're lining up." "Go," I said. "Tell Pastor I had to make sure the door didn't lock behind us." She laughed like I made a joke and trotted upstairs. When I was alone, I closed my eyes. I don't know why I did, except there are some things you learn better with one sense at a time. I pressed my fingers to the alarm. Nothing. I put my ear to the furnace closet door and heard the low work of heat making itself. The extension cord hummed faintly, that second brain of mine answering itself.
I followed the cord with my hand to where it slipped under the door. The padlock was one of those you buy with a little key, 2 for $1 at the hardware store, so you can feel like you have prevented the inevitable. I pulled bobby pins from my hair and wondered when the last time was I'd done something like this. 1979 came to mind, and a lock on my sister's jewelry box I had no business touching. I listened to myself breathe. Then I did a thing I will not tell my grandson about until he is grown and can hear it like a story you tell about a woman you used to be. I picked that cheap lock with hands that remembered 100 buttons and 3 broken hearts. It gave. Inside the closet, the furnace shone like a mean animal. Next to it sat a little orange bottle of adhesive remover with a skull and crossbones on the back label in case literacy had failed the lesson. A folded towel lay in the corner. The extension cord ran from an outlet to a small power strip, and on the strip were plugged a space heater set to high and a phone charger with no phone attached. The space heater was pointed toward the towel. I stood there and felt my face go cold. Then I crouched, pulled the strip switch, and everything went quiet except the simple truth of a heart beating. I took the bottle of adhesive remover, the space heater's plug, the power strip, the towel, and the lock and carried them to the center of the basement floor like items on a test no one had prepared me for. When I stood, I looked up, and there, just above the doorframe, I saw the thing that made everything click into an ugly cord. A small, brand new wireless camera. It pointed down the hall toward the closet and then toward the stairs, a little glass eye. Someone had been watching what happened down here. Someone wanted to know who had turned off the test. I took a photo of the camera with my phone. I took a photo of the alarm with the dead light. I took a photo of the extension cord under the door. I took a photo of the bottle and then flipped it to see the brand, Mendosolv. I remembered that label in a way that made me dizzy. 2 summers before, Grace and I had scraped wallpaper in the laundry room, coats peeled like snakeskins, and I had bought adhesive remover at the hardware store. We laughed because the label warned about flammability, like it had never met a woman determined to get glue off drywall. I locked the furnace door again, this time with the lock in my pocket. Then I climbed the stairs and moved like someone underwater through a swim no one could do for me. The ceremony had just begun. Claire stood at the front, in a dress that made every woman in the room adjust her posture. Michael's eyes were wet. Ethan sat next to Mrs. Larkin, clutching his sketchbook like a raft. Pastor Dan said the words, the old words that have married pairs of hands through centuries of foolishness and faith. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, does not boast, is not proud. I sat down in the second pew and held my handbag with both hands, like very old women do, and thought about all the times the word love had been used like white paint over mold. Halfway through Michael's reading, when his voice wavered at the word always, I stood up. My chair scraped the floor. An honest sound. I walked to the center aisle. People turned toward me not like they do for drama, but like they do when their bodies know something before their brains do. I didn't look at Claire. I didn't look at the flowers. I looked at my son, the small line between his eyebrows where worry sleeps, and then at my grandson who lifted his sketchbook almost involuntarily like a little bird flaring its wings. "I'm sorry," I said to the room, and then I said, "No, I'm not." The quiet was complete. Even the air waited. "Before you finish," I said, and now I looked at Pastor Dan because I needed someone to let me, "there's something we need to check downstairs." Claire smiled, little lines fanning from her perfect eyes. "Nora," she said, as if we were in a kitchen, as if I had forgotten sugar. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. "If everything's fine down there, then everything will be fine up here." Pastor Dan looked at me and then at Michael. Michael looked at Claire. Claire looked at me in a way that makes you understand why they called them looks that can kill. Then she laughed a small laugh and said, "This is—" She didn't finish the sentence. Laughter needs air. "I won't have my grandson in a building with a dead alarm," I said, my voice in that place mothers discover when the usual places have no force left. "Pastor, the basement smoke detector's been cut, and there's a heater pointed at a pile of cloth with solvent nearby. Maybe that's how people do it in the city. That's not how we do it here."
The room did that sway people do when the floor might not be where they left it. Michael stepped toward me. "Mom," he said gently, which is almost always code for "please don't," and which in this case sounded like a prayer for the right thing to be the easiest thing. "Are you sure?" I handed him my phone. "Look," I said. He looked. He turned pale in increments, west to east. He stared at the photos of the dead blink, the cord, the camera, the bottle. "Claire," he said, and I have never heard a man say a name like that, like he had once held it between his teeth for comfort. She blinked very slowly. "This is humiliating," she said. "For you, Nora, for all of us. Your grief has made you paranoid. You need help." She turned to the room, asking everyone to join her in a laugh it was too late for. "She's making up stories about alarms to ruin our day. She doesn't want me here." She opened her hands like Christ on the cross and looked at the room like a jury she had bought drinks for. "I am trying so hard to love this family," she said. "But how can you love a woman committed to hating you?" Ethan stood up on the pew seat and held his drawing over his head with both hands. The paper trembled, but the lines did not. "Don't go to the basement," he said, his voice high and thin, but steady. "The alarm is too loud, so somebody unplugs it. And she says heaters make cold rooms friendly." If you want to know the moment a room decides something, it's not when the loudest person finishes their sentence. It's when the quietest person starts. Mrs. Larkin reached for Ethan's ankle like you hold a flag steady in a wind. Pastor Dan put his hand on his lectern like a sailor holding a wheel. Michael looked at Claire. "Did you touch the alarms?" he asked. The whole church leaned toward the answer. She did not move for a full beat. Then she did something so practiced it should have been taught in high schools. She cried without wrecking her eyeliner. "I cannot keep doing this," she said through perfect tears. "I tried to modernize the house. I had a contractor look at the system. He said the basement unit was wired wrong and could trigger for no reason. I unplugged it while we waited for the part. I don't want my wedding ruined by a false alarm. I was protecting all of us."
"By pointing a heater at a towel," I said. I held up the photo of the bottle. "By leaving solvent and heat alone together? By putting a camera downstairs to watch who might go check? What were you going to protect with that, sweetheart? The truth?" She looked at the photo and then up at me, and her tears quit like they had been paid hourly and we ran out of coins. "You are a small-town woman with small-town suspicions," she said, each word clipped as if it had tried to get away. "I have built houses from nothing, Nora. I know more about keeping people safe than you will ever know." "Is that what you did for Grace?" I asked, not entirely sure why I said it until it came out of my mouth and sat there like a stone. "Kept her safe?" Michael made a sound I have only heard from mothers giving birth and men staring at wreckage. "What are you implying?" he asked me, but he was not pushing me away. He was pulling a thread and hoping it was just thread. "The day Grace died," I said slowly, "I came by to bring her lasagna, remember? I set it on the porch because I thought you were both out. When I turned to go, I saw a car at the curb, a white Range Rover with a dent in the rear bumper. I thought nothing of it until later when the police had questions and the block was blocked off. 2 weeks after, I saw the same car at the hardware store and noticed a sticker on the back window, a small, white, minimalist house outline, "Your design firm." Claire's chin lifted. Lots of people have Range Rovers. Lots of people use that sticker. We did a charity event. Lots of people don't go into a widow's laundry room and make the air flammable, I said, voice shaking now, not with fear, but anger. Lots of people don't stand in a church while a child trembles and decide to make the tremble about themselves. I looked at Ethan, who was looking at me like I was the last step on a staircase. I looked at my son, who was gripping the edge of the pew with white knuckles and breathing like he had gone up a hill he hadn't trained for. "Call the police," I said to Pastor Dan. "Let them look where the camera looks. Let them test the alarm. Let them test the bottle's fingerprints. If I'm wrong, I will stand at the town square with a sign around my neck that says so. If I'm right, I will watch certain things happen that should have happened a year ago."
Michael tore off his boutonniere and set it on the pew the way you set something fragile for later. He walked down the aisle toward the side door. He did not look back. Pastor Dan nodded to the youth minister, who pulled out his phone and went down the hall to the office to make the call. Claire said my name again, once, like it could be a spell, and when it didn't work, she sat down slowly in the front pew and crossed her ankles. While we waited, the church did something I didn't think church would do for me anymore. It held me. People whispered, yes, but not the way whispers cut. They whispered like a blanket is a whisper. Mrs. Larkin made Ethan sit and drew him into her side and stroked his hair until his shoulders loosened. The florist came and set an extra stem of eucalyptus in a vase on the windowsill because her hands needed to do what they know. Pastor Dan breathed. The choir breathed. I breathed. The police came with the controlled pace of people determined to be boring. This is the thing about justice. It looks like paperwork from the outside until it doesn't. They took photos, went downstairs, came back up with the bottle in a glove bag. They took my phone and handed it back. They studied the camera, called the church's Wi-Fi company, got a login from a flustered, good man on the phone who had baptized 3 of the officers. They found footage. They watched it in the office and then came into the sanctuary and asked Claire to come with them. She stood like a person getting up from a massage. "This is ridiculous," she said calmly. "My lawyer will love this town." She walked down the aisle like a runway, and when she reached my pew, she leaned in for only me to hear. "You could have had a nice life. Grandmothers ruined things with their old, stubborn memories." Then she smiled at the room, a polished mirror catching highlight, and went with the officers. Silence has a shape. This one expanded to fill the whole sanctuary, then reduced to a small, bright thing and sat beating in the center of us like a second heart. Michael returned with a face like he'd been carved new. He took Ethan's hand. He took my hand. He handed me back the boutonniere, and I pretended to fuss with it so I wouldn't cry where everybody could see it. People stood slowly. Pastor Dan said, "We're going to release everyone, but before we do, would you bow your heads with me for 1 minute? We're not going to pray for names today. We're going to pray for truth. Truth tells the best stories, and sometimes the hardest." He bowed his head. People did what they were told. I didn't. I watched Ethan tracing the edge of his drawing with one finger like a man reading a map. Outside, the sky had turned itself into a deeper silver. Leaves skittered down the church steps. People did that delicate thing of asking if we needed anything while also saying they would bring pot roasts without waiting for an answer. We went home. I made grilled cheese because that's what you make when the world has tipped and you need to trick it into righting itself. Ethan ate his with the kind of attention that heals grandmothers.
Michael sat and stared at the cookie jar like his future was inside it, taking a nap. That evening, a detective named Alvarez came by in a windbreaker. She was a woman who made truth want to straighten its shirt. She asked a series of questions that felt like knitting back something someone had cut. She took Ethan's drawing with respect. She asked if Grace had had enemies. She asked about the day of the fire. We answered and didn't, and sobbed and didn't. She handed me a card with a number on it and told me to call if I remembered the shape of anything my brain had filed under too much. Days lengthened in that peculiar grief way, like saltwater taffy pulled and pulled until it's pale and longer than you thought sugar could get. The church rescheduled the wedding and then canceled it. The florist stopped by with leftover flowers, which is how roses sometimes arrive at the door with as little ceremony as a bill. The paper said, "Investigation continues," in print that had no room for names. People dropped off food. I invented chores. Michael shaved, didn't shave, shaved again. Ethan drew sunshine with rays that reached all the way to the corners of his paper. And then, on Wednesday afternoon, he drew a house with a green door and handed it to me like a certificate. "This one is safe," he said. When Detective Alvarez called on Thursday, I was stirring a pot of soup like a woman in a painting. "We executed a search warrant at Miss Carlton's apartment," she said, using Claire's last name the way professionals do. Names as tools, not intimacies. We found 3 wireless cameras registered to her email. 1 matched the unit at the church basement. We also found correspondence with an insurance adjuster. There's a pattern of claims on properties she's had design contracts on. Small fires in laundry rooms or utility closets, nothing dramatic. Quick response, minimal structural damage, maximum payout for contents lost. Grace's file is similar, though more severe. She paused, and I heard paper move. We also found in a box under her bed a bracelet with initials GH inside. Did Grace have a bracelet with her initials? I closed my eyes and saw Grace at Christmas peeling tape from a little box delicately so she could reuse the paper. I saw the bracelet, thin, a gift from Michael when Ethan was born, GH engraved inside for Grace Hayes. She had worn it on her right wrist with the faint satisfaction of a woman who'd never had jewelry that mattered until someone loved her the way people are supposed to be loved. "Yes," I said, and I could hear the part of me that wanted to be wrong quit.
"We're building a case," Alvarez said gently. "We'll need statements. I'm sorry for the timing of all of this, but I also feel I should tell you something off the record as a woman who has watched many kinds of families pass the same corner. You did the right thing in that church. It was a hard, holy thing. Mothers and grandmothers sometimes are the only alarms anyone hears." After I hung up, I went and stood in the doorway of Ethan's room. He was building a town with blocks, a grocery, a school, a library, 2 houses connected by a green arch for a door. He looked up, face open. "Want to help, Grandma?" he asked. And I wanted to say, always. I wanted to say, until my bones are dust and my dust is useful, and that usefulness is a story you can sit under when it rains. I said yes and sat on the carpet and took a red block like a good student. In the weeks that followed, the town moved on the way towns do, outwardly normal, inwardly adjusted. People at the market pretended not to look and then looked. Men at the hardware store avoided the aisle with adhesive remover. The owner moved the display behind the counter like a sacrament. At school, Mrs. Howard called to say Ethan had joined a little reading group voluntarily, that he laughed when another boy forgot how to pronounce puddle, that he covered his ears for a drill and then uncovered them on his own and did not need to be carried. Michael began seeing a counselor. He told me the counselor put a sticky note on his file that said, "Not your fault," and then made him leave it there and look at it every time he came in. He added 2 more alarms to the house and showed Ethan how they beeped and why. He moved the space heater to the attic, and then to the town swap day, and then to the dump. One Saturday, I drove to the river and sat on a bench and let the air tell me what season it was. I thought about all the ways danger wears good shoes. I thought about how you can live a little life and a big life at the same time, and how sometimes the little one saves the big one by insisting on ordinary kindness, like alarms that work and doors that unlock when you need them to. I thought about grace, about how people say "passed away," as if the person did it politely, when some deaths are rude and some are criminal. I thought about the day she taught Ethan to tie his shoes by looping laces around his fingers and saying, "Make rabbit ears, then make them hug." He had looked at her like she invented hugs.
In December, after court beginnings and arraignments and words my mouth does not prefer, Michael came by with Ethan and 2 cups of cocoa. We sat at my kitchen table, with the heat going because the old place refuses to learn modern tricks. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, and then stopped because the word had too many jobs. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I wanted to be happy so bad I put my hands over my eyes and called it faith." He stared into his cocoa like it could absolve him of something more than marshmallows. "Thank you for taking your hands down." I touched his cheek like I had when he was small and had a fever. The people who deserve blame are already carrying it. You will put yours down when it's ready. Ethan slid off his chair and came around to me, lifting his arms without asking. He smelled like snow and pencil shavings. "Can I sleep at your house tonight?" he asked, like he hadn't already been doing that half the week. "Only if you draw me 2 pictures," I said, "one of a safe house, one of a brave boy in it." He grinned and ran for his backpack. He sat on the floor by the radiator and drew with the kind of focus that could power a small city if we learned how to harness it. The first drawing was a house with a green door and a chimney that puffed neat clouds like a gentleman's pipe. The second was a boy with a cape, hair sticking up like he had been electrocuted by joy. He handed them to me one at a time, and I told him what was true. "You're an artist." He shrugged, but his mouth curled. By spring, the case became what cases become: docket numbers, letters, a date in the paper that felt both too soon and too late. Alvarez called to prep me for the stand. "She'll ask why you didn't speak sooner about the bracelet," she said. "They'll ask if you're bitter about your son moving on. They'll ask if you dislike successful women. I dislike liars, and I dislike alarms that don't work, and I dislike the way people will call a thing an accident because the alternative requires paperwork and bravery." She laughed once, small but real. "You'll be fine." At the courthouse, the fluorescent lights had the same attitude as the church basement, but the air didn't smell like lemon oil. It smelled like sweated nerves and vending machine sugar. Claire arrived in a navy suit that could have passed the bar on its own. Her lawyer moved like a man who trusted his shoes almost as much as he trusted his voice. When I took the stand, I felt like a woman from a postcard, sentimental and a little exaggerated. And then I told what I knew. The morning in the basement, the lock, the camera, the photos, the drawing, the words she had said in the church as if truth needed her permission. I talked about Grace's bracelet because the dead are owed plainness. When the lawyer asked me if I had watched too many television crime shows, I said, "No, sir. I watch Birds, Stew, and the people I love." Detective Alvarez laid out her case like a careful quilt. Piece by piece, nothing fancy, everything fitting.
insurance records, camera registrations, purchase histories for heaters in 3 towns, texts with a contractor that read like a curtain pulled aside. Might not need big fire. Just set it up to look like an old house with a faulty line. You know how these things go. The jury did look like television for 1 second then, heads pivoting in unison to stare at Claire like someone had placed a snake among salads. There was no single clap of thunder verdict. There was the quiet of a room returning to itself after a long storm. There were dates and words and degrees of guilt for acts a mouth does not want to own. There was a sentence that sounded both not enough and better than nothing. When it was done, people stood dusting themselves of invisible powder the way cats shake rain off as if they could choose whether to be wet. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Alvarez shook my hand. "I have daughters," she said. "I hope someone would do this for them and for me." Then she looked at Ethan. "Can I buy one of your drawings?" He looked at me, panicked and proud, then nodded. "How much?" he asked gravely, and she laughed with her whole face the way grown women don't often allow themselves. "I think you just became a professional," she said, pressing a $5 bill into his palm. He gave her a house with a green door. That night we had burgers at the diner because sometimes victory tastes like ketchup and onions. Michael relaxed in his chair like a man whose shoes finally fit. Ethan announced he wanted to build a birdhouse. I ordered a slice of pie for the table and we ate it with 3 forks and no talk for a good 5 minutes, which is how you know something is healing. If you've listened this far, if you've let your heart sit with mine, I want to leave you with a truth that cost me quiet. Children draw what grown-ups refuse to say out loud. They draw the door we keep pretending isn't there. They draw the alarm we unplug because it interrupts brunch. They draw the red we tidy into pink on calendars. And sometimes, if we let them, they hand us back our courage, folded in construction paper. You do not need to be a hero to save anyone. You need to listen when a small voice says, "Don't go down there today, Grandma." You need to ask why the basement camera is pointed at the heater. You need to love people more than you love being comfortable at their weddings. Months later, in June, we had a ceremony in the backyard with no tuxedo, no paper doves, no florist invoice. Pastor Dan came in his rolled-up sleeves. Mrs. Larkin brought potato salad and wrote, "Love is patient" on a Post-it and stuck it to the lemonade pitcher. Michael took Ethan's hand and promised to keep the alarms working and the doors honest. Ethan promised to show us every drawing before he put it under his bed. I promised to be old as long as possible. We hung a green wreath on the front door because we had earned that color. The maple leafed itself out with the kind of confidence that only time gives. Later that evening, when the light went that liquid color it goes right before the day forgives itself, Ethan tugged my sleeve. "Grandma," he said, "do you think Mommy can see?" He meant Grace. He meant now that the lies had names and a house again. I looked at the shape of him in that light and knew my answer was a story, not a fact. "I think love watches us even when we're not brave," I said. "And I think love got very loud when it needed to, and we listened. That counts." He thought about that and nodded in that solemn way he had, the way of boys who are almost men and men who remember being boys. He ran to get a sketchbook and came back breathless. On a fresh page, he drew a house and put 2 windows in it like eyes and drew a little figure at one window with hair that looked like sunshine if sunshine cut itself with kitchen scissors. He labeled it Mommy. In the other window, he drew a woman with gray lines for hair and a smile that took up more room than the rest of the face. He labeled it Grandma. Then he put a green door at the bottom and wrote, "Open." I hung that drawing on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tomato, and when the furnace kicked on that night, it sounded like an old dog again, the friendly kind. Before I went to bed, I checked the alarms, not because I didn't trust the house anymore, but because love is patient and kind and not proud, and also because love has batteries and asks to be tested sometimes. All of them blinked back at me, small red heartbeats in the dark. I whispered goodnight to the honest lights and to the photograph of Grace in the hall, and then to Ethan, who, asleep, looked like every baby looks to a careful world, like a warning and a promise. If this story found you where you are, if it turned on even one small light in a place someone asked you to keep dim, tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if your town calls union meetings potlucks or suppers. Tell me if your house has a basement with a door you've been pretending is just a wall. I'll be here, an old woman with flour on her hands, making soup and telling the same story to anyone who needs it in 1,000 different ways. Children know. Houses remember. And the truth, left to itself, will learn to ring. The afternoon after our green door ceremony, the mail brought a packet from the court, forms and an official letter that read like a machine whispering, "Please." I set it aside and took Ethan to the hardware store instead. He promised the detective a birdhouse, and my eyes had promised him a Saturday that felt like mercy. We picked a kit with a little round doorway you could stick your finger through, sandpaper that made the air smell like school, and a tiny bottle of non-toxic paint in a shade the label called Meadow. The owner rang us up and threw in an extra brush and tried not to say "you're brave" out loud because men in flannel have trouble with sentences that long. At home, we built the birdhouse at the kitchen table. Michael held the tiny nails and tapped the way a man does when he is practicing a new life, careful and steady, and struck by how good it feels to line up edges. I read the instructions in the bossy voice I used to use for bedtime books. Ethan painted the roof green and the door blue, and then looked at me, thoughtful. "Birds don't need alarms," he said, a question wrapped in a statement. "They have each other," I said. "They yell." He laughed, a clean sound, and dabbed a dot above the doorway like a peephole. "We can be the alarm," he said. "We are," I said, and then we were quiet, the kind that isn't empty. We hung the birdhouse in the maple. Over the next week, a pair of chickadees moved in without asking for references. Ethan checked on them like a foreman. We watched the parents bring threads and seeds, and one morning we heard the frantic chorus of babies, an honest alarm calling for what it needed. We stood under the tree, not talking for a long time, letting life do what life does when no one turns off the blinking light. If you're at your own table right now, if you've got a drawing on the fridge and a voice in your chest insisting on quiet when quiet is wrong, I want you to hear me across whatever distance this platform pretends is nothing. You are not paranoid for asking why. You are not dramatic for standing up in a room and being the first person to say, "Wait." You are the alarm we all grew up assuming someone else would test. I promise you, the soup tastes better when the house is honest. The flowers smell brighter when the camera is taken down. The church looks like a church again when the heater is where heaters belong. I promise you, the people who love you more than they love the way things look will forgive you for making the day difficult. They might even, if they're lucky, get a second wedding one day with paper plates and no doves, just potato salad and a boy with a cape. We had ours already. I called it a backyard promise day. The RSVP list was small. One pastor with rolled sleeves, one tired son starting to be new, one boy who knows how to draw doors you can open, and me, an old woman who pays attention for a living, standing by the grill with a spatula, my face lit by a flame I turned off myself.